Mikki Morrissette.
Thank you, Tina, and thanks everybody for being here to be part of the energy of the sanctuary here today. I have actually sat right in this spot on Wednesday night. I was part of a consciousness circle that I co-founded here in the Twin Cities. That's how I met Dave and Linda Austin. And in fact, special thanks to Linda for inviting me, suggesting that I talk here with you today. I love the intersection. I have a couple special creative projects right now. Connected in the Deep is about the science of mystical experience. And I've just started doing something called MinneapolisGreen.com, which is about the sustainable identity here in Minneapolis. And it's interesting to me that this is a perfect place, an intersection for those two particular, somewhat disparate topics, but they have a really natural home here at Lake Harriet Spiritual Community. This truly is a vortex under the vaulted dome, and I appreciate being here. So your topic this month has been about revealing the real you. And what I'll be talking about today is why I think revealing the real you is like an onion. We talk about what is the true me. And I will tell you first a few stories about my own life. I'm actually a storyteller, I think, from birth. I was writing really awful poetry at a very young age. I wrote a lot of rhyming verses every year for the Catholic elementary school talent show. My friend Mary might remember some of those. I went on to create a neighborhood newspaper. I was probably about 11. I have no idea what there was to write about, but I do vaguely recall collecting 25-cent subscriptions from the neighbors. I wrote a play around 6th, 7th grade, The Adventures of Marco Polo. And it was the late movie after the Johnny Carson show that I scripted. I made the ragtag neighborhood boys in my neighborhoods be in the audience and be part of this. I also wrote a song that Johnny Carson's special guest, Mac Davis, sang. So those were my earliest memories. But you know, middle school, my mother went back to college, and we were studying the Holocaust in school. And she introduced me to her humanities professor, and he was a Holocaust survivor. I was probably around 7th, 8th grade, and he told me the very real experiences that he had in a concentration camp. And I was hooked then on the power of storytelling to have an impact. Around that same time, we were also learning in school about the evils of smoking. And I wrote my father, who was a longtime smoker, I wrote him a very impassioned letter about the evils of smoking and why I wanted him to quit so that he would be around for me and my brother. And he quit cold turkey. So, talk about the influence of words. I definitely realized that there was a lot of power in both influence and inspiration around words. I got my grandmother's hand-me-down Smith Corona typewriter when I was about 13 as a Christmas gift, and I burst into tears. This was so cool, a typewriter. I went on by 16. I was working at the community newspaper. I eventually started a school newspaper in Prior Lake with my friend Troy. I went on to college newspaper editing. And then a whole series of things, some radio. I worked at TPT with a Jim Klobuchar TV show, did PR communications for the Minnesota North Stars, a whole variety of things. And eventually, about the age of 21, I decided I was going to embark on a life in magazine publishing. And for that, I needed to move to New York City. So I had never been there. I went to visit for a week. I stayed with my friend Mindy, who was an actress there at the time. And I sat across, I was a very weird 21-year-old. I sat across from the Time Inc. building, and I chanted, I will work there someday. I will work there someday. And during that week, I had lunch with Craig. He was a writer at Sports Illustrated. I had met him the previous summer when I was an intern at the U.S. Olympic swimming team. And when I came back from this week trip to check out New York, I told my roommate here in Minneapolis that someday I will marry Craig. And I did. I moved to New York a few months after that. I did marry Craig. Mary and Mindy were there. Mindy was in the wedding party, I remember. Lovely dress. And I did work many different jobs at Time Inc. over my 18-year career in New York. Yes, writing is where I really found my identity. It is the real me. But is that true? You know, is my real me really about work? Things started to shift for me when I was about 30. I had gone to New York to have adventures, and I was just working all the time. I felt my life was just so settled. And I left my marriage to Craig. Wonderful man. He's still very important in my life today. I started traveling. At some point, I took a solo trip to Madagascar. I had traveled around Australia, Thailand, the Greek islands. I visited all of the 50 states. I won a writing contest at some point and got a free round-trip ticket to Ireland. Spent a lot of time there. I had met a lot of Irish lads at the New York pub in my neighborhood, and I stayed with a lot of their families. It was a really great trip, and that's actually where I had this very transcendent moment. I was pretty much broke by that point. I think I had just come out of some relationship of some sort, but I was over there in Ireland, and I had taken a walk near Galway, and I sat on a rock, and I had a very different chant this time. It just came out of nowhere, and I just said, life is good. Life is good. I came back from that trip a little transformed, apparently, a friend told me. So there were a variety of other adventures. I went around Eastern Europe and actually went to Auschwitz and saw some of that a little bit firsthand. I wrote a novel about two travelers, two young men, one traveling to escape, the other traveling to find a life. I think, really found my new real me, which was about serendipity and new experiences. My parents were not happy about this. They were not happy, for one, that I had left such a perfect man. I've been purging through some old memorabilia lately, and I uncovered some old correspondence from that time when I was trying to explain my decision and a variety of decisions I was making. I wrote to them, I would rather give up security, very impassioned. I would rather give up security than to give up the thrill and challenge of discovery. I need to be challenged, even with the insecurity and inconstancy of the freelance lifestyle, in order to feel alive. This is something that has always been there. You can read it in my letters to Troy 10 years ago. So the real me was not about work. It was about finding new experiences. But was that true? I had my most important job ever at some point. I had to pay for all those trips. I took a job at Time Inc. I was making $100,000 a year. I had, in my mid-30s, unexpectedly fallen in love with somebody I used to work with at Sports Illustrated for Kids. He had a child from my previous marriage. And seeing the two of them together, I realized for the very first time that I wanted to be a mother. I told him that, and for my 36th birthday, he took me out to a really lovely dinner and a poetry reading in Soho with the poet Charles Simic. And then the next day, he broke up with me. I was devastated. But I also, I owned my own apartment. I was making a fair amount of money. I decided I was going to become a mother anyway. And I told a friend this, and he offered to donate sperm to the cause. And I became a mother for the first time soon after my 37th birthday. My life was no longer about my job. It was no longer about wanderlust, even if I could afford it. It was about my daughter. It was about being a mom, and everything changed. Then 9/11 happened, which was traumatic in its own way, and things changed even more. After 18 years of living in New York, I decided I was done with that, and I moved back here to Minnesota to be closer to family. My one-bedroom apartment in New York translated to a very nice large house here in Minneapolis, and I realized I had both the time and the space to have a second child, so my son Dylan was born just before my 42nd birthday. This is, I know, the deepest connection that I have ever had, that I will ever have, this unconditional love for my kids. So this, then, is my true identity. But now, midlife, maybe there is no true identity. What is real about personal identity? I read a book recently by Rebecca Neuberger Goldstein called Betraying Spinoza, the Renegade Jew Who Gave Us Modernity. She wrote, "What is it that makes a person the very person that she is, herself alone and not another, an integrity of identity that persists over time, undergoing changes, and yet still continuing to be until she does not continue any longer? I stare at the picture of a small child at a summer's picnic, clutching her big sister's hand with one tiny hand. That child is me, but why is she me? I have no memory at all of that summer's day. It's true that a smooth series of contiguous physical events can be traced from her body to mine, so that we would want to say that her body is mine. Yet that series of physical events has rendered the child's body so different from the one I glance down at this moment. The very atoms that composed her body no longer compose mine. And if our bodies are dissimilar, our points of view are even more so. She has continued to exist, survived her childhood illnesses, the near drowning in a rip current on Rockaway Beach at the age of 12, other dramas. So as Goldstein asks us to consider, is our personal identity related to our bodies? Is it our minds? Is it our dramas, the stories we tell ourselves? Is our identity the stories that we tell ourselves? Certainly there is something in the stories that we tell that reveal who we are individually. You know, our body might be the one thing that, at least outwardly, is with us from birth to death. It's the container that shapes the stories and the collection of our identity in bits. But we also know that our stories change so much. How much importance can something have if its intensity changes? What of the things that we consider super, super important that in time are no longer? Those mad love affairs, that all-important job promotion, those diary entries we wrote when we were 16. As I said, I recently started purging some of the memorabilia that I have stored in boxes over all these years, getting rid of things that no longer seem to have any meaning for me, like this popcorn box that I saved from some apparently momentous high school event that I no longer remember what it was. A few weeks ago, I had a fascinating dinner with some blasts from the past. I went there with my best friend still from high school days, Troy. He has suggested, and I think he's right, that if we met now, we would not become friends. He doesn't understand half the things I do, and I don't understand half the things he does, but he's a constant that I relish in my life. We went there to meet, among others, a girl that I hung out with in 9th or 10th grade who has lived a very different life with very, very different beliefs than my own. She was in town reconnecting with an old friend of mine that she reconnected with, yes, on Facebook. I invited my first high school boyfriend, Scott, who I have less in common with than anyone else I have ever dated, yet we have maintained contact for more than 30 years now. Would I ever date him again? No. But it is fun that we stay in touch. He kind of represents that first magical moment when I met someone, this at a homecoming football game. And my first crush was there, the neighbor boy, Tommy. He's still married to the high school sweetheart. And yeah, I could easily still have a crush on him. Some things do not change. So are these seemingly random intersections from our past important even when they don't reveal something deeper about us? Can we pick and choose the stories that we want to keep as important? Well, what about the stories, those random facts that just seem to pick us? Those random events that are stuck in our memory banks for no reason, like the time I was in second grade and my snow pants fell down around my ankles. I can't forget that moment. I have no idea why. There's a whole variety of things like that. Sometimes we pull together random facts to create a story that might be misleading or incomplete. I could have stood up here and started off by telling you about the house fire that impacted our family when I was a child, about the difficult, conflicted, hormonal teenage boy babysitter that I had when I was young, about my dad's heart attack at age 42. And you might sum up by thinking that I had a traumatic childhood. I might, at times, claim that I had a traumatic childhood. We all have. It depends on what facts we pull out. We tell ourselves a story simply by choosing which facts we want to tell. We also leap to conclusions about other people's stories all of the time, wanting to create a coherent story without knowing anything at all. We size them up instantly, sometimes simply based on what they are wearing. I met with a salesman recently, a big, burly, easygoing guy in a Vikings sweatshirt and a Vikings cap, and I thought I knew the kind of conversation we were going to have. And we ended up having a very nice chat about consciousness and about healing the planet. Our consciousness might also create a story about ourselves that simply isn't true. As Brian Williams, the NBC anchor, might, now suspended for misrepresenting a moment in his life, might say, yes, our storytelling brains can have a life of their own. But does even our fiction reveal something about ourselves? For many years, as a young girl, I pretended I had an older brother who was in the Vietnam War, and that he had died in the Vietnam War. In truth, he had died a year before I was even born, at birth. Yet that fiction was a story I told myself for a reason. I wanted someone who could protect me. And years later, I still think of that older brother as my guardian, somebody who only lived for a few minutes. Sometimes we try to pretend that some things never happened. We try to forget things that do matter: loss, trauma, pain, disappointment. At the end of my freshman year of college, my brain blocked something that I didn't want to remember about a coworker. I wanted to keep the job I loved at the college newspaper. I didn't want anybody to know he had sexually assaulted me one night. So I pretended it didn't happen. For many years, I pretended it didn't matter. But of course it did, and eventually, my consciousness demanded that I pay attention to it, that I tell myself and others the story. And it's been an incredibly interesting part of my personal story, this journey. Its impact on my 20s, what was unlocked when I finally went to a therapist, how free I felt after acknowledging its impact, after eventually forgiving myself for not being able to prevent it from happening. And even more recently, how much freer I now feel forgiving him. I know his own story was impacted by his own traumas. We intersected in a terrible way one day. But how important it was to realize that that particular moment did not define me. It simply became part of my skin. As Parker Palmer has said, the past isn't fixed and frozen in place. Instead, its meaning changes as life unfolds. So, personal stories as identity. Our emotions around people, experiences, they change over time. Sometimes we create stories that aren't complete, never complete. Simply the facts we choose to pull together that day to tell us a story of how to behave, how to react. Again, what is it that makes a person the very person that she is, herself alone and not another? An integrity of identity that persists over time, undergoing changes, and yet still continuing to. I'm going to ask now what stories from your own life tell the story about who you are today. I'm going to give us just a few minutes now silently to just think about what in your own life has had meaning, been transformational. Either stories that changed you or stories whose meaning for you changed over time. So we'll just think about that for a few minutes. Okay, now that I've given you a few minutes to stop having to listen, I'll start talking again. So, I recently started reading The Biology of Belief, Unleashing the Power of Consciousness, Matter, and Miracles by Bruce Lipton. Have any of you read it? He was a tenured faculty member of the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine. He indicates that it is not a cell's nucleus that contains the brain of the operation, but its membrane that picks up signals from the environment that sets things in motion. A cell can actually exist long after the nucleus is removed. The nucleus is what enables a cell to reproduce, but it doesn't do any of the other important things that cells do, including communication with other cells. While the Human Genome Project was getting a lot of headlines in the 1990s about isolating the genes that determine our lives and our health, or so we thought, scientists in the newer field of epigenetics were learning that nutrition, stress, and emotions can modify those genes. There are certain receptor proteins, like a cell's sense organs or molecular antenna, that read vibrational energy fields, kind of like a tuning fork. In other words, cells are aware. They're picking up energy from the environment. Lipton wrote, "Biological behavior can be controlled by invisible forces, including thought, as well as it can be controlled by physical molecules, like penicillin." Here's another important line from his book. "In simple terms, the character of our life is based upon how we perceive it." How we perceive it. When I was finishing my degree at New York University, required reading was The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn. I was annoyed that this was required reading. I was a journalist and a writer. I had nothing to do with science. I had no interest in science. But now I realize that science, life, is about interconnectedness. Many people I've been talking with for my Connected in the Deep website believe that we are approaching a paradigm shift in science. And Kuhn is the one who explained the history of scientific revolutions the best. So I reread his book with a better attitude. Kuhn pointed out many interesting paradigm shifts in his book. One of them is a scientific revolution that makes some people uncomfortable even today. Some religious groups have certainly resisted Darwin's theory of natural selection. But in general, Kuhn wrote, it wasn't the idea that bothered people the most, the idea that species change or that man descends from apes. That wasn't the biggest troublesome spot for many people. Darwin's professional colleagues had recognized that there had been evidence for that accumulating for decades. The issue, Kuhn said, was that Darwin was essentially asking people to accept that evolution was not a goal-directed process. If God or whatever nudge guided the first creation of life did not have an actual plan, then what direction did we have? If our evolution was a series of random mutations and survival instincts, then where was our guiding force? It was discomforting to think we're simply adrift in the universe with no goal set by God or nature. As Kuhn wrote, what could evolution, development, and progress mean in the absence of a specified goal? Darwin's theory was making the point that there's a process that transfers knowledge from stimuli into sensation, which is very similar to what Lipton is saying today. Knowledge is basically transmitted through education and becomes more effective by trial and error. Kind of like how we live our day-to-day lives. We collect moments, we try on new things, we adapt, we try something else, we move on to the next moment. So my message today is the onion. I believe that revealing the real you, understanding the core of our existence, is not about getting into the center of the onion. It's not about peeling back the skins layer by layer to get underneath our real truth. I think it's about the layers we add to the place we started from, big and small. It's the skin, membrane after membrane, layer after layer, that's important. The goal is not to find some kernel of essence in the center. We're not digging deeper into the core of the earth. Our sustainability is in the energy all around us. You to me, we to they. Our evolution is outward to our connections in the universal field. We are telling our story as individuals, as a collective, every day. And every day is different. Past, present, future. Our evolution is constantly changing. Even the stories we tell ourselves, about others, changes every day. Goldstein wrote that in mathematics, we see that facts are so because they necessarily have to be so. Descartes was impressed by the mathematical method because once something is mathematically proved, we need never concern ourselves with it again. The very possibility of doubt has been expelled. Our knowledge is secure. We know we are not duped. For Spinoza, such worries about doubting and being duped are beside the point. She said in her book about Spinoza that he appreciated mathematics, and by extension scientific proofs, because they reveal connections. They reveal connections. That's not the same as saying they reveal the truth. As David Breeden, who's the minister at First Unitarian Society, said recently, truth is our attempt to find something that never changes. And that doesn't exist. Everything changes. So there is no truth. I think again of that line from Parker Palmer, the past isn't fixed and frozen in place. Instead, its meaning changes as life unfolds. An Atlantic Monthly magazine article last fall was about midlife crisis. It indicated that midlife crisis is actually simply the low end of a U-curve before we finally begin to reach upward. It marks the time we let go and relax a little bit. We eventually stop comparing ourselves. We stop competing. We realize there's no juicy middle that we're supposed to attain. The article said, as people age and time horizons grow shorter, people invest in what is most important, typically meaningful relationships, and they derive increasingly greater satisfaction from these investments. Midlife is, for many people, a time of recalibration, when they begin to evaluate their lives less in terms of social competition and more in terms of social connectedness. In other words, we realize that what happens today and tomorrow and yesterday is only just a moment in time. We're not owned by our moments. We're not owned by our traumas. We're not owned by the stories we tell ourselves or about others. We're all simply pivot points, intersecting with each other, making new meaning from past moments. We are a work in progress, contained in an ongoing work of progress, connected to every other work in progress. I have one more story, my favorite pivot point story. It comes from Rachel Naomi Remen. She wrote about a woman who was married to an emotionally abusive husband, and they were on a business trip in New York City one day. And they were standing waiting for a street light to change, and she commented that she thought this building across the street was really very interesting. And in what he considered the anonymity of a New York City sidewalk, he said out loud something he would normally only say at home. He just said, well, that just goes to show how stupid you are, because that is an ugly building. And as the light turned green, before they started walking across the street, an elderly New York City woman, who didn't know them at all, turned around and said to the woman, I agree with you, I love that building. And then she turned to the husband and said, and you, sir, are an ass. And then she walked across the street. That was it. This stranger had this immense impact because that woman realized that her husband was an ass. And it took a while. She took about a year to kind of get herself together emotionally and financially so that she could leave the marriage. And she eventually became a domestic violence advocate. So, we can never know the impact that we have our profound impact on each other, the moments and the people, the experiences, the losses, everything that becomes part of our skin, part of our layers, influences not only ourselves, but everyone around us in big ways and small. We are the ongoing story of the universe. My last excerpt, this one by Calvino from Cosma Comics. He wrote, "In the universe now, there was no longer a container and a thing contained, but only a general thickness of signs, superimposed and coagulated, occupying the whole volume of space. It was constantly being dotted minutely, a network of lines and scratches and reliefs and engravings. The universe was scrawled over on all sides, along all its dimensions. There was no longer any way to establish a point of reference. The galaxy went on turning, but I could no longer count the revolutions. Any point could be the point of departure. Any sign heaped up with the others could be mine, but discovering it would have served no purpose, because it was clear that independent of signs, space didn't exist and perhaps had never existed. I do not believe there is a special truth that never changes at our center. I do not believe there is a pre-Darwinian goal towards some kind of perfection. I believe there is only evolution. The center of the onion is where we start, not where we aim to go." Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for contributing and again being part of the energy today. I felt very honored to be able to talk with you today. Thank you.